Hi folks, welcome. I'm Kayaoğlu. The dust has settled from Israel's September 9 attacks to take out Hamas leaders in Qatar's capital Doha. But while the dust has settled, the political and diplomatic fog still has not dissipated. And those fogs really boil down to the question of how done it, not so much who done it, because we know it was Israel. But more importantly, did America know and how much it knew that its one regional ally, Israel, was going to attack its other regional ally, Qatar? So in this video, I want to offer the two scenarios that have been discussed on social media and the press so far, and offer my own, a third scenario, if you will, in that through strategic deception, Israel might have aimed to contain the political fallout, especially to try to insulate its relations, a special relationship with the United States, as well as its standing within the region, especially vis-a-vis Arab countries with which it has either friendly-ish relations or at least normal relations. All right, let's get to it. Scenario one, which I call a dash across Saudi airspace. This one's fairly self-evident. When Israel's airstrikes took place on September 9th and the images came out, a lot of people assumed that the Israelis probably took a direct route through Jordan, through northern Saudi Arabia, approaching the Persian Gulf, and getting close to Qatar, and then releasing their precision munitions, i.e. smart bombs. And it might have gone something like this. We're on our way, oh America, tell your air defense systems and the Saudis not to shoot at us. Haha, but what am I saying? You can never spot us in our F-35s, you terrorists. F-35s were promised to Israel 3,000 years ago. Now, one problem with that scenario is that tactical aircraft such as F-16s, F-15s, F-35s, when we're talking long range, and it's about 1,000 kilometers from Israel through Jordan, through northern Saudi Arabia, at more than 1,000 kilometers actually, to approach Qatar. So the whole operation would have needed at least one, if not two, trips with tanker aircraft to refuel. So it figures why there was a lot of speculation on September 9th and thereafter that U.S. Air Force and Royal Air Force, that is British Air Force tanker aircraft that were aloft over Qatar might have helped the Israeli jets. Even though that has not only not been proven, there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise. Especially in the case of British aircraft, British tanker aircraft, we know that there's an incompatibility between their systems and the Israelis. The whole thing with the basket/drogue. And then the other type of refueling, the system is called a boom, which is where the tanker aircraft's needle-looking thing sticks itself into the aircraft's fuel intake spot and then tops it off. And of course, there's the ridiculous notion that the Qataris would have just looked on as the tanker aircraft of allied countries that are operating from an airbase in Qatar, helping the aircraft of another country that's attacking them. Of course, the Qataris are already in a weird spot. On the one hand, they were attacked by the Iranians during the 12-day war back in June, and now, almost 3 months later, they got attacked by the Israelis. And meanwhile, Qatar hosts Hamas leaders because they were basically asked to do so by the Israelis and the Americans so that they could mediate between the Palestinian organization on the one hand, and on the other, the Israelis and the Americans. And then they got attacked for it. And I know I take a jocular tone in a lot of my videos, including this one, but this I want to say seriously. On the September 9 attacks by Israel, besides 5 Hamas members, a Qatari policeman also died as a result of the attacks. Now, Qatar's population is about 2.8 million, but of that 2.8 million, only about 300,000 of them are Qatari citizens. The rest are international workers. So in a small and tightly knit community like that, even the death of one citizen, and a policeman at that, is really going to shake up such a close-knit community. That's not going to be good for Israel. And on a similar note, it's also debatable whether the Saudis just fell asleep or just let the Israelis pass by. It's equally suspicious for them that if they knew that they would allow Israel to attack a fellow Gulf Arab country. Now, of course, relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar were not very good in the past, to say the least, but they have patched up their differences since then. And it's really inconceivable for Saudi Arabia to open some of those old files or allow Israel to open those old files this way. And of course, the Americans have their own radar and air defense systems scattered throughout the region. We'll come to the American connection later on. So that brings me to scenario number 2, another type of mad dash across Saudi Arabia. And there's actually a developing consensus on this, on how Israel conducted the airstrikes of September 9th. The Wall Street Journal reported 3 days after the attack that Israeli aircraft first flew south toward the Gulf of Aqaba and then the Red Sea, and then turned eastward, fired their shots, and then returned to bases. So it wasn't really the aircraft, but Israeli air-launched ballistic missiles that made that mad dash across Saudi airspace. Turkish defense analyst Arda Mevlütoğlu, something of a guru, compared that scenario to a layup as you would have in basketball. Of course, when you consider the distance, it would be less of a layup and more of a three-pointer if you want to go about with basketball analogies. Now, this proposition of a layup firing ballistic missiles from a distance makes a bit more sense, but it's still got some of the weaknesses as the first scenario. Now, Israel has the Blue Sparrow ALBMs, air-launched ballistic missiles, which have a range reportedly of about 2,000 kilometers. So the distance is not going to be an issue there. But the problem is, ballistic missiles are not invisible to radar. Stealth aircraft are not easier, it's just that they have a very low radar visibility. But ballistic missiles can be tracked and they can be seen, if you will, through other sensors, through other systems. And unlike cruise missiles, which can go very close to the ground, ballistic missiles have to follow what's called a parabolic trajectory, sort of gain altitude and then using gravity, gain speed, and then hit their targets that way. And as with the first scenario, you still have the problem of on-the-ground actors sleeping at the wheel. Saudi expert Mohammed Al-Qahtani discussed this on a LinkedIn post. He said, under either scenario, whether someone allowed the Israelis through or slept at the wheel, that's not a good look for the Americans, because a lot of the, especially Patriot systems in the region that are American-made, with the supporting electro-optical systems, the sensors, the radars and whatnot, are either operated by the Americans or the air defense forces of regional countries were trained by the Americans. So if we're thinking that these systems didn't work, they weren't able to catch the Israelis, or they were made not to catch the Israelis, is not going to be good for the United States. That's not a good marketing strategy at a time when the United States, when the Trump administration wants to sell more of its weapons to the rest of the world. Okay, we have finally arrived at scenario 3, my turn. Before I render my take on the events of September 9 and the aftermath, I would really appreciate it if you could kindly click like on this video, share the video with your friends, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. That way, more good people like you could get access to fun and informative content on history and geopolitics. All right, scenario 3. So under this third scenario, I'm entertaining the thought of whether Israel lied to the United States about attacking a target other than Qatar. And what I have in mind is Iran or pro-Iran militia groups in Iraq. There's been some movement on that front that the United States has recently started declaring some of these pro-Iranian militia groups as terrorist organizations. So let me map out this scenario. Scenario 1 was, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Persian Gulf, and then back. Scenario 2 was Gulf of Aqaba, Red Sea, fire ballistic missiles, turn back. Scenario 3 suggests that the Israelis might have flown into Syria and then proceed to Iraq. Meanwhile, or before the attack, tell the Americans that they're going to attack targets within Iraq or within Iran. Meanwhile, continue their approach towards the Persian Gulf. And really, in that case, the Israelis would have been able to keep up their ruse virtually until the very last seconds of their attack. Now, I know I'm going into speculation territory here, folks. A friend of mine whom I interviewed for my Turkish channel has already shot down this idea that the Israelis had to use Syrian or Iraqi airspace to get to Qatar. But bear with me here, because there's been a lot of speculation since September 9th. It's with respect especially to what the Americans knew and when they knew it. The interesting thing is that the answer to that question could be fairly expansive, because there's a difference between the Trump administration knowing before the Israeli jets took off from their bases and the Americans then knowing when the Israeli jets were aloft, or when they were approaching Qatar, or when they had already fired their missiles. And of course, remember, right after the attacks happened on September 9th, there were a lot of news reports that said that the Trump administration was somewhat giddy, happy about the Israeli attacks because they were taking out terrorists. But then they found out that the attacks did not take out the Hamas leadership, and so that was not going to be a good look on the United States. And then they realized, probably Trump did, that Qatar is a very important country for America, so they started to distance themselves from the Israeli attack. However, Israeli journalist Barak Ravid, writing for Axios website, and based on his conversations with Israeli officials, said that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu informed President Trump on the morning of September 9th, and that's morning in Washington, and around 8 a.m. And the airstrikes, the first explosions in Doha, happened at 8:50. So there was a 50-minute window there between when Netanyahu and Trump started talking and when the explosions happened. And in the same story, Israeli officials are saying, hey, look, Trump knew beforehand, and if he wanted to stop this, he could have just told Bibi, i.e. Netanyahu, to stop it. Meanwhile, the Trump White House continues to deny foreknowledge of the attacks. This scenario, too, has a lot of gaps. I'm looking at them, but they go quite well with Netanyahu's actions and words since September 9th. You know, bragging about how mighty the state of Israel is, even picking fights with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan over the status of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, hoping to sow discord among Arab and Muslim countries in their efforts to come up with a cogent, a coherent response against Israel's actions and excesses in the region. Meanwhile, the genocide in Gaza, which now even the United Nations is acknowledging as a genocide, continues. And the Israeli Prime Minister's approach, at least for now, seems to be working. There was a joint summit between the leaders of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, almost 60 countries, which met in the Qatari capital of Doha on September 15th, and their response so far doesn't look that impressive. But that will change, and they're already changing, as Bob Dylan would say. After September 9th, Saudi Arabia signed with Pakistan essentially the equivalent of NATO Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on the other. And it bears repeating, keep in mind, Pakistan is the only Muslim nation on earth with nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Egypt, along with my country, Turkey, announced that they will hold joint naval drills in the Eastern Mediterranean next week. And the final bit is, just as I was shooting this video, word came in that an Emirati think tank floated the possibility of Arab and Muslim countries closing their airspace to all Israeli aircraft, which could shrink the Israeli economy by as much as 6%. And it's telling that this is coming from the United Arab Emirates. The UAE, as you may know, is the Arab country that has become Israel's closest Arab regional partner since signing the Abraham Accords under U.S. aegis back in 2020. And I'm not even going to go into the crisis of confidence that the United States is going to face among Gulf Arab countries, which for decades have been buying American hardware and hiring American advisors to train their military, to train their domestic security services. There's a lot more to discuss, and we'll get to all of that in good time, folks. For now, what I ask you is leave a comment below, share your thoughts with us, and I really want you to not hold back your own educated guesses, as well as some of your wild scenarios on the meaning of the September 9 attacks, on how the Israelis did all this, and what might happen next. Thanks a lot. I'll see you soon.